大家好，
大家好，
今日又繼續我哋嘅讀你聽遠大前程。OK， 我哋讀到第13節㗎啦，我哋第12次嘅錄音。咁啊，上回講到邊度呢？
上回講到阿 Pip 佢好驚俾人去捉，
點解啊？
因為佢之前同嗰個 Paleface 打交。
係啊，打到佢趴喺度，
點
流血
冇人捉佢，
自己
但係佢又
諗多咗。
成日諗佢，又冇去諗 Estella 乜滯。Estella 對佢時冷時熱咁樣。
都冇乜點熱過，其實一味都係落佢啫嘛，冇時冷時熱。
有啲好啲。
都主要都係唔好啊，主要都係對佢。
之後臨尾，老太婆話要Joe 去佢見Joe，佢家姐好猛靜。係
啦 ，Pip 個家姐好嬲啦，咁啊同佢反晒面咁滯啊！
就係咁咯。
咁究竟阿婆婆要見Joe做咩呢？咁啊，今次就應該會講啦，係咪？咁我開始讀咯喎。Chapter 13. It was a trial to my feelings on the next day, but one to see Joe arraying himself in his Sunday clothes to accompany me to Miss Havisham's. However, as he thought his court suit necessary to the occasion, it was not for me to tell him that he looked far better in his working dress. The rather, because I knew he made himself so dreadfully uncomfortable, entirely on my account, and that it was for me he pulled up his shirt collar so very high behind, that it made the hair on the crown of his head stand up like a tuft of feathers. At breakfast time, my sister declared her intention of going to town with us, and being left at Uncle Pumblecook's, and called for when we had done with our fine ladies, a way of putting the case, from which Joe appeared inclined to augur the worst. The forge was shut up for the day, and Joe inscribed in chalk upon the door the monosyllable, "Out," accompanied by a sketch of an arrow supposed to be flying in the direction he had taken. 即係佢應該係寫 out，O-U-T， 但係因為佢唔識英文啊嘛，佢寫個讀音出嚟啦 ，H-O-U-T， out。We walked to town, my sister leading the way in a very large beaver bonnet, and carrying a basket like the Great Seal of England in plaited straw, a pair of pattens, a spare shawl, and an umbrella. Thought it was a fine bright day. I was not quite clear whether these articles were carried penitentially or ostentatiously, but I rather think they were displayed as articles of property, much as Cleopatra or any other sovereign lady on the rampage might exhibit her wealth in a pageant or procession. When we came to Pumblecook's, my sister bounced in and left us. As it was almost noon, Joe and I held straight on to Miss Havisham's house. Estella opened the gate as usual, and the moment she appeared, Joe took his hat off and stood weighing it by the brim in both his hands, as if he had some urgent reason in his mind for being particular to have a quarter of an ounce. Estella took no notice of either of us, but led us the way that I knew so well. I followed next to her, and Joe came last. When I looked back at Joe in the long passage, he was still weighing his hat with the greatest care, and was coming after us in long strides on the tip of his toes. Estella told me we were both to go in, so I took Joe by the coat cuff and conducted him into Miss Havisham's presence. She was seated at her dressing table and looked round at us immediately. "Oh," said she to Joe, "you are the husband of the sister of this boy." I could hardly have imagined dear old Joe looking so unlike himself, or so like some extraordinary bird, standing as he did speechless, with his tuft of feathers ruffled, and his mouth open as if he wanted a worm. You are the husband, repeated Miss Havisham, of the sister of this boy. It was very aggravating, but throughout the interview, Joe persisted in addressing me instead of Miss Havisham. Which I meant to say, Pip, Joe now observed in a manner that was at once expressive of forcible argumentation, strict confidence, and great politeness. As I hopped and married your sister, and I were at the time what you might call a single man. Well, said Miss Havisham, and you have reared this boy with the intention of taking him for your apprentice. Is that so, Mr. Gargery? You know, Pip, replied Joe, as you and me were ever friends, and it were looked for around to betwixt us, as being calculated to lead to loss. Not but what, Pip, if you had ever made objections to the business, such as its being open to black and sut in, or such like, not but what they would have been attended to, don't you see? Has the boy, said Miss Havisham, ever made any objection? Does he like the trade? Which it is well beknown to yourself, Pip, returned Joe, strengthening his former mixture of argumentation, confidence, and politeness, that it were the wish of your own heart, and there were no objection on your part, and Pip, it were the great wish of your heart. It was quite in vain for me to endeavour to make him sensible that he ought to speak to Miss Havisham. The more I made faces and gestures to him to do it, the more confidential, argumentative, and polite he persisted in being to me. Have you brought his indentures with you? Asked Miss Havisham. Well, Pip, you know, replied Joe, as if that were a little unreasonable. You yourself see me put them in my hat, and therefore you know as they are here. With which he took them out and gave them, not to Miss Havisham, but to me. I'm afraid I was ashamed of the dear good fellow. I know I was ashamed of him when I saw that Estella stood at the back of Miss Havisham's chair, and that her eyes laughed mischievously. I took the indentures out of his hand and gave them to Miss Havisham. You expected, said Miss Havisham as he looked them over, no premium with the boy? Joe, I remonstrated, for he made no reply at all. Why don't you answer? Pip, returned Joe, cutting me short as if he were hurt. Which I meant to say that were not a question requiring an answer betwixt yourself and me, and which you know the answer to be full well no. You know it to be no, Pip, and wherefore should I say it? Miss Havisham glanced at him as if she understood what he really was better than I had thought possible, seeing what he was there, and took up a little bag from the table beside her. Pip has earned a premium here, she said, and here it is. There are 25 guineas in his bag. Give it to your master, Pip. As if he was absolutely out of his mind with the wonder awakened in him by her strange figure and his strange room, Joe, even at this pass, persisted in addressing me. This is very liberal on your part, Pip, said Joe, and it is as such received in grateful welcome, though never looked for, far nor near, nor nowheres. Not and now, old chap, said Joe, conveying to me a sensation, first of burning and then of freezing, for I felt as if that familiar expression were applied to Miss Havisham. And now, old chap, may we do our duty, may you and me do our duty both on us, by one and another, and by them which your liberal present have conveyed to be, for a satisfaction of mind of them as never. Here Joe showed that he felt he had fallen into frightful difficulties, until he triumphantly rescued himself with the words, and from myself far be it. These words had such a round and convincing sound for him that he said them twice. Goodbye, Pip, said Miss Havisham. Let them out, Estella. Am I to come again, Miss Havisham? I asked. No, Gargery is your master now. Gargery, one word. Thus calling him back as I went out of the door, I heard her say to Joe in a distinct, emphatic voice, the boy has been a good boy here, and that is his reward. Of course, as an honest man, you expect no other and no more. How Joe got out of the room, I have never been able to determine, but I know that when he did get out, he was steadily proceeding upstairs instead of coming down, and was deaf to all remonstrances until I went after him and laid hold of him. In another minute, we were outside the gate and it was locked and Estella was gone. When we stood in the daylight alone again, Joe backed up against the wall and said to me, "Astonishing!" And there he remained so long saying, "Astonishing!" at intervals so often that I began to think his senses were never coming back. At length he prolonged his remark into, "Pip, I do assure you, this is astonishing," and so by degrees became conversational and able to walk away. I have reason to think that Joe's intellects were brightened by the encounter they had passed through, and that on our way to Pumblecook's he invented a subtle and deep design. My reason is to be found in what took place in Mr. Pumblecook's parlour, where, on our presenting ourselves, my sister sat in conference with that detested seedsman. "Well," cried my sister, addressing us both at once, "and what's happened to you? I wonder you condescend to come back to such poor society as this. I am sure I do." "Miss Havisham," said Joe, with a fixed look at me, with an effort of remembrance, "made it very particular that we should give her, were it compliments or respect, Pip." "Compliments," I said. "Which that were my own belief," answered Joe. "Her compliments to Mrs. J. Gargery." "Much good they'll do me," observed my sister, but rather gratified too. "And wishing," pursued Joe, with another fixed look at me, like another effort of remembrance, "that the state of Miss Havisham's health were stitched as would have allowed, were it, Pip?" "Of her having the pleasure," I added. "Of ladies' company," said Joe, and drew a long breath. "Well," cried my sister, with a mollified glance at Mr. Pumblecook, "she might have had the politeness to send the message at first, but it's better late than ever. And what did she give young Rantipole here?" "She give him," said Joe, "nothing." Mrs. Joe was going to break out, but Joe went on. "What she give," said Joe, "she give to his friends, and by his friends were her explanation. I mean into the hands of his sister, Mrs. J. Gargery." Them were her words. "Mrs. J. Gargery. She may not have known," added Joe, with an appearance of reflection, "whether it were Joe or George." My sister looked at Pumblecook, who soothed the elbows of his wooden armchair, and nodded at her at the fire, as if he had known all about it beforehand. "And how much have you got?" asked my sister, laughing, positively laughing. "What would present companies say to £10?" demanded Joe. "They'd say," returned my sister curtly, "pretty well, not too much, but pretty well." "It's more than that, then," said Joe. That fearful impostor, Pumblecook, immediately nodded and said, as he rubbed the arms of his chair, "It's more than that, Mum." "Why, you don't mean to say," began my sister. "Yes, I do, Mum," said Pumblecook. "But wait a bit. Go on, Joseph. Good in you. Go on." What would present company say?" proceeded Joe, "to £20? "Handsome would be the word," returned my sister. "Well then," said Joe, "it's more than £20. That abject hypocrite, Pumblecook, nodded again and said with a patronizing laugh, "It's more than that, Mum. Good point. Follow her up, Joseph." "Then, to make an end of it," said Joe, delightedly handing the bag to my sister, "it's £25. 520? 520? "It's £25, Mum?" echoed the basest of swindlers, Pumblecook, rising to shake hands with her. "And it's more than your merits, and I wish you joy of the money. If the villain had stopped here, his case would have been sufficiently awful, but he blackened his guilt by proceeding to make me into custody, with a right of patronage that left all his former criminality far behind." "Now you see, Joseph and wife," said Pumblecook, as he took me by the arm above the elbow, "I am one of them that always go right through with what they've begun. This boy might be bound out of hand. That's my way. Bound out of hand." "Goodness knows, Uncle Pumblecook," said my sister, "we are deeply beholden to you." "Never mind me, Mum," returned the diabolical corn chandler. "A pleasure's a pleasure all the world over. But this boy, you know, we must have him bound. I said I'd see to it, to tell you the truth." The justices were sitting in the town hall near at hand, and we at once went over to have me bound apprentice to Joe in the magisterial presence. I say we went over, but I was pushed over by Pumblecook, exactly as if I had that moment picked a pocket or fired at Rick. Indeed, it was the general impression in court that I had been taken red-handed. For, as Pumblecook shoved me before him through the crowd, I heard some people say, "What's he done?" The others, "He's a young un too, but looks bad, don't he?" One person of mild and benevolent aspect even gave me a tract ornamented with a woodcut of a malevolent young man fitted up with a perfect sausage shop of feathers and entitled "To be read in my cell." To be read in my cell. The hall was a queer place, I thought, with higher pews in it than a church, and with people hanging over the pews looking on, and with mighty justices leaning back in chairs with folded arms or taking snuff, or going to sleep, or writing, or reading the newspapers, and with some shining black portraits on the walls, which my unartistic eye regarded as a composition of hard bake and sticking plaster. Here, in the corner of my indentures were duly signed and attested, and I was bound. Mr. Pumblecook holding me all the while as if we had looked in on our way to the scaffold, and have those little preliminaries disposed of. When we had come out again, and had got rid of the boys who had been put into great spirits by the expectation of seeing me publicly tortured, and who were much disappointed to find that my friends were merely rallying round me, we went back to Pumblecook's, and there my sister became so excited by the 25 guineas that nothing would serve her but we must have a dinner out of that windfall at the Blue Boar, and that Pumblecook must go over in his chaise cart and bring the Hubbles and Mr. Wopsle. It was agreed to be done, and a most melancholy day I passed, for it inscrutably appeared to stand to reason in the minds of the whole company that I was an excrescence on the entertainment. And to make it worse, they all asked me from time to time, in short, whenever they had nothing else to do, why I didn't enjoy myself, and what could I possibly do then but say I was enjoying myself when I wasn't. However, they were grown up and had their own way, and they made the most of it. That swindling Pumblecook, exalted into the beneficent contriver of the whole occasion, actually took the top of the table, and when he addressed them on the subject of my being bound, and had fiendishly congratulated them on my being liable to imprisonment if I played at cards, drank strong liquors, kept late hours or bad company, or indulged in other vagaries which the form of my indentures appeared to contemplate as next to inevitable, he placed me standing on a chair beside him to illustrate his remarks. My only other remembrance of the great festival are that they won't let me go to sleep, but whenever they saw me dropping off, woke me up and told me to enjoy myself. That rather late in the evening, Mr. Wopsle gave us Colin's Ode, and drew his blood-stained sword in Thunderdown, with such effect that a waiter came in and said, the commercials underneath sent up their compliments, and it wasn't the Tumbler's Arms. That they were all in excitement, they were all in excellent spirits on the road home, and sang Old Lady Fair, Mr. Wopsle taking the bass, and asserting with a tremendous strong voice that he was the man with his white locks flowing, and that he was upon the whole the weakest pilgrim going. Finally, I remember that when I got into my little bedroom, I was truly wretched, and had a strong conviction on me that I should never like Joe's trade. I had liked it once, but once was not now. 即係呢度係講佢哋去到婆婆屋企，婆婆就問佢：咁呢個細路係咪會追隨你做一個鐵匠咧？咁啦，咁然之後Joe咧就成程就唔回應阿婆婆，佢就同阿 Pip 講嘢。人哋問佢，佢又唔答個婆婆，喺度同阿 Pip 講，即係佢係答緊佢嘅，但係佢又向住阿 Pip 講。阿 Pip 就話：喂，你答佢啦，你唔好同我講啦。但係 Joe 就死都唔肯。跟住 Joe 嘅反應就係話佢會傳佢 佢手藝俾佢嘅，只要阿 Pip 願意嘅話，即係大概咁嘅意思啦。佢寫得好深嗰度，好多深字咯，特登唔知點解。好少英國佬寫嘅寫咁多深字。咁然之後個太太就話：你以後唔使再嚟啦。既然呢個細路係屬於你嘅話，咁然之後咧就俾咗袋錢俾阿 Joe，就同佢講呢啲就係阿 Pip 喺度嘅報酬啦，咁啦。咁然之後咧就佢哋翻到去就同阿 Pip 個家姐講咯，就係阿 Pip 賺咗好多錢啊咁樣。520 pounds 就咁，我唔知520嘅意思係100啊，5乘20啊，定係520啊，定係點啊？總之佢話俾佢聽，佢攞到咁多錢。我都要 verify 究竟佢係咪真啊？應該就係嘅。咁然之後咧，佢哋第二日咧就的咗阿 Pip 去個 court 嗰度，就係咧其實就應該係去登記啦，其實就係去登記佢哋兩個之間嗰個師徒關係，或者佢哋兩個人之間嘅關係，即係阿 Pip 同阿 Joe 之間嘅關係。我都唔明點解要做呢啲咁嘅登記㗎嚇。咁但係佢哋就的確有咁做到啦。然之後做完之後咧，就全部人都陪佢哋一齊翻屋企咁樣，個人都戥佢哋好開心啦。咁但係點解咧？就係因為咁佢哋收到錢啊嘛，佢哋收到錢啊嘛，終於都咁。比較難明啊！呢一節我都要再睇一睇個 detail，先至可以全面咁去了解。就係咁。你有啲咩問題啊？冇。好，下次再講。OK，拜拜。